They will tell you the vampire king's wedding ended in blood. That part is true. What they won't tell you is that the blood never touched a single throat, because a maid nobody had ever bothered to learn the name of made sure of it. Her name was Celine Ashford, and by the time this story is over, you will understand exactly why a woman with no title, no fortune, and no army chose to risk everything on a single, unforgivable act in front of the most powerful bloodline in the kingdom. But first, you need to see what she saw. The royal cathedral had never held so many nobles at once. Hundreds of ancient vampire houses filled the pews beneath towering Gothic arches, gold candlelight flickering off crowns that predated most human nations. At the center of it all stood King Lucian Draven, tall, composed, the kind of ruler who was said to have never once raised his voice at a servant in 300 years of rule. And beside him, radiant in white and pearl, his bride. The ceremonial blood cake was wheeled in on a gilded cart, 4 servants straining under its weight. It was tradition older than the crown itself. Every noble house would drink from a slice blessed in the royal blood, a symbol of unity between bloodlines that had warred for centuries. The ceremonial knife was lifted, and that's when Celine Ashford walked forward. No one stopped her. No one even looked twice. Servants moved through royal ceremonies like furniture, unseen, unremarkable. She was simply the maid pouring wine, the maid straightening tablecloths, the maid nobody in that cathedral could have named if you'd asked them a minute earlier, which is exactly why nobody was ready for what happened next. She reached the bride in 3 steps. Before a single guard could react, she seized her by the hair and slammed her face down into the towering blood cake. The cathedral froze. Frosting exploded across the altar. A goblet shattered against stone. Commander Cassian's hand snapped to his sword. Prince Alaric rose so fast his chair toppled behind him. Lady Evelyn screamed. And King Lucian, a man who had faced down rival vampire lords without blinking, simply stood there, completely unable to process what he was watching. Celine didn't run. She didn't flinch. She lifted a small silver vial into the candlelight, her hand steady even as 300 nobles stared at her like she'd finally, truly lost her mind. "No one eats this cake," she said. "The bride poisoned it." Silence swallowed the cathedral whole. Here's what nobody in that room knew yet, that Celine hadn't lost her mind at all, that every second of what was about to unfold, the accusation, the chaos, the arrests that would follow before sunrise, had been building quietly for 6 weeks, one overheard word at a time, while she smiled and served wine and let everyone believe she was exactly what they assumed: furniture, invisible, harmless. By the end of this story, you won't remember the cake at all. You'll remember the maid who noticed what an entire kingdom of ancient immortal nobles missed completely. Welcome back if you're a regular here, and if this is your first time, I'm glad you found your way in. Drop where you're watching from tonight. I read every comment. This is a story about loyalty, hidden conspiracies, and the terrifying cost of being the only person willing to speak the truth. It begins like a fairy tale. It does not stay one for long. Let me introduce you to the people whose lives collide in that cathedral. Celine Ashford, 26, sharp-eyed, endlessly overlooked, and about to prove that being underestimated is its own kind of weapon. King Lucian Draven, the vampire king who believed, against every tradition of his bloodline, that mercy made a ruler stronger, not weaker. A man so trusting that his trust would very nearly cost him everything. Lady Seraphina Vale, beautiful, composed, adored by every noble house in the kingdom, and hiding something none of them could see: Lord Cassian Thorne, the king's commander, steady and loyal. The kind of man who refuses to accuse anyone without proof. Prince Alaric Voss, Lucian's cousin, the only person in that cathedral whose instincts had been screaming for weeks that something was wrong. Lady Evelyn Morcant, Seraphina's closest friend, standing beside a traitor without the faintest idea. Now, let's go back. 6 weeks to be exact, to the quiet, ordinary morning when Celine first noticed something that didn't fit. The palace had begun preparing for the wedding the moment the engagement was announced, and for weeks, Celine moved through it the way she always did, polishing silver in the early hours before the household woke, refilling candles in the east corridor, delivering fresh linens to guest chambers most nobles never bothered to thank her for. She had served in the palace long enough to know its rhythms better than most of the nobility who lived there. She knew which halls echoed and which stayed silent. She knew King Lucien took his morning wine watered down, not full strength like the rest of the court assumed. She knew he remembered her name. Celine, not girl, not you there, and asked after her well-being in a way that made the other servants adore him without question. It was that same quiet attentiveness that made her the only person in the entire palace to notice something strange. The week wedding preparations truly began. Lady Seraphina Vale had insisted, politely but absolutely, that she alone would personally inspect the ceremonial blood cake before it was ever brought near the reception hall. No royal bride in the kingdom's recorded history had ever made that request. It seemed harmless. A small, strange preference from a woman who had everything else about her perfectly, flawlessly composed. Celine said nothing. She simply kept polishing the silver, kept her eyes down, kept doing exactly what a maid was supposed to do, but somewhere in the quiet of that morning, a single thought settled into her chest and refused to leave. Something isn't right. She had no idea yet how right she was, or how far she'd have to go to prove it. By the second week of preparations, the palace had transformed into something out of legend. Garlands of black roses wound up every marble column. Enchanted candles lined the great hall, burning silver instead of gold in honor of the union. Seamstresses worked through the night on Seraphina's gown, and every noble house in the kingdom sent gifts so lavish the storage vaults had to be expanded twice. And through all of it, Seraphina Vale was radiant. She charmed the elderly duchesses with effortless grace. She remembered the names of visiting dignitaries after hearing them only once. She laughed at exactly the right moments, deferred to Lucien in front of the court, while somehow still commanding every room she entered. By the time the second week ended, half the kingdom had already decided she was the finest queen they'd have in a century. Celine watched all of it from the edges of every room, the way she always did, and the more perfect Seraphina became, the more something in Celine's chest refused to settle. It was the small things first. 3 servants who had worked the East Wing for years were suddenly reassigned to distant quarters, no explanation given beyond a note bearing Seraphina's seal. A shipment arrived at the servants' gate well past midnight. Unmarked crates, carried in by men Celine didn't recognize, gone again before dawn. When Celine asked one of the guards about it the next morning, he simply shrugged and said the bride had requested privacy for wedding matters. Nobody questioned a bride wanting privacy for her own wedding. Nobody except Celine, who had spent 6 years learning exactly how the palace was supposed to move, and who now watched it move in ways it never had before. There were the corridors too. The unused West Passage, sealed off since before Celine had even started working in the palace. Its door was found unlatched twice in 1 week. Celine mentioned it to no one. She simply noted it, the way she noted everything, and kept polishing silver like she hadn't seen a thing. Then came the conversations. Twice now, Celine had entered a room to find Seraphina speaking in hushed tones to unfamiliar nobles, their crests unlike any house she recognized, and twice the conversation had died the instant the door creaked open. Seraphina would smile, introduce the strangers as old family friends, and the moment would pass so smoothly that anyone else would have forgotten it within the hour. Celine did not forget it, and then there was the kitchen. Seraphina had never once, in 6 weeks of wedding preparations, shown interest in the menu, the flowers, or the seating arrangements, all the things brides were expected to obsess over. But she visited the royal kitchens no less than 4 times that week, always alone, always dismissing the kitchen staff to give them a rest, always emerging exactly when the blood cake was being prepared. Celine began to understand that Seraphina wasn't planning a wedding. She was planning something else, and using the wedding to hide it. That same week, in a quiet corridor near the west courtyard, Prince Alaric Voss found Commander Cassian polishing his blade in the armory and closed the door behind him before speaking. "Something is wrong with her," Alaric said without preamble. Cassian didn't look up. "With who?" "You know who." Cassian set the blade down slowly. "Seraphina. She disappears for hours and no one questions it because she's the bride. She's dismissed 3 servants I trusted with my own chambers, and every noble who's met her says the same thing. Charming, perfect, not a flaw to be found. Alaric, nobody is that flawless. You're describing a woman who's good at being liked," Cassian said, not a woman plotting treason. I've known liars my whole life, Cassian. I was raised around them. This isn't charm, this is performance. Cassian exhaled and finally met his cousin's eyes. Bring me proof, and I will stand beside you in front of the king myself. Bring him suspicion with no proof, and you will hand Seraphina exactly what she needs to paint you as a jealous rival trying to poison his happiness. I won't do that to him. Not without something real. Alaric said nothing more, but he didn't look convinced either. Celine didn't know about that conversation, but that evening, carrying an armful of fresh linens toward the lower servant halls, she found out something far worse. The corridor beneath the palace was one she rarely used, a narrow stone passage that ran past the old wine cellars toward the servants' quarters. It was there, passing the entrance to the long-abandoned East Chapel, that she heard voices. She shouldn't have stopped. Every instinct she'd built over 6 years of invisibility told her to keep walking, to let whatever this was remain someone else's business. She stopped anyway. The chapel door stood slightly open, weak candlelight spilling through the gap. Celine set the linens down without a sound and crept closer, pressing herself into the shadow of the doorway. Inside, Seraphina stood before 3 nobles Celine had never seen in the palace before, their crests dark, unfamiliar, edged in a red that didn't match any house sworn to King Lucien's court. The final shipment arrives tomorrow, one of the nobles said, voice low. After that, there's no undoing it. There won't need to be, Seraphina answered, and her voice, the warm, musical voice the entire court adored, was colder than Celine had ever heard it. Once the blood cake is served, the throne dies with it. The chapel went silent. Celine didn't breathe. She didn't move. She stood frozen in that doorway as the full weight of what she'd just heard settled into her bones, cold and absolute. This wasn't a rumor. This wasn't a servant's overactive imagination. This was real. She backed away slowly, one careful step at a time, until she was far enough from the chapel to turn and run. Silent, swift, her heart slamming against her ribs the entire way back through the stone corridor. By the time she reached her small chamber above the servants' hall, she understood something that made her hands shake as she gripped the edge of her narrow bed. The wedding wasn't going to be interrupted by an assassination. The wedding was the assassination. And unless someone stopped it, every noble house loyal to King Lucian would be dead before the reception ended. Celine didn't sleep that night. She sat by the narrow window of her chamber, watching the moon crawl across the sky, turning the same question over and over until it wore smooth in her mind. Who would believe her? She had no proof. She had a handful of overheard words spoken in the dark by a woman the entire kingdom adored, and a feeling in her chest that something ancient and terrible was coming. If she walked into the throne room tomorrow and repeated what she'd heard, she wouldn't be thanked. She'd be dismissed as jealous, unstable, perhaps even dangerous, a maid trying to destroy the happiness of a king who had shown her nothing but kindness. Seraphina's allies would simply deny everything, and by the time anyone thought to investigate, every trace of the conspiracy would be gone, buried, laundered into innocence. No, an accusation without proof wasn't a weapon. It was a noose, and Celine would be the one to hang herself with it. So she decided, sitting alone in the dark, that she would not accuse. She would investigate. By morning, Celine had already begun rebuilding herself into someone new, not the quiet, invisible maid the palace had always known, though she made sure to still appear exactly that. Underneath the folded linens and polished silver, she was becoming something else entirely. She started with roots. Celine had worked the palace long enough to know its public halls by heart, but now she studied its bones. The narrow servant passages that ran behind the walls of the noble quarters, the maintenance corridors beneath the kitchens, the old drainage tunnels that connected the wine cellars to the outer gardens. She memorized which doors creaked and which stayed silent, which corridors were watched by guards and which were forgotten entirely. Within days, she could move through nearly the entire lower palace without crossing a single occupied room. Next came the schedules. She began noting, quietly and without a single written word that could be found and used against her, the patterns of the household. When the kitchen staff took their breaks, when the guards changed shifts along the west corridor, when Seraphina's personal attendants were dismissed for the evening, leaving her chambers unwatched for exactly the length of time it took Celine to deliver fresh candles and collect worn linens. It was during one of those windows, in the 3rd week, that she found the letters. They were in the hearth of Serafina's private sitting room, half-burned, curling black at the edges. The kind of thing anyone else would have swept into ash without a second glance. Celine knelt by the cold fireplace and, with the careful patience of a woman who had spent years handling delicate things without breaking them, lifted out 3 fragments that had survived the flames. Most of the words were gone, but what remained was enough, a single phrase. After the toast, the guards will be occupied with, and a fragment of a signature, elegant and unfamiliar, ending in a flourish shaped like a serpent's tail. She didn't take the fragments. Taking them risked discovery, and discovery now meant everything unraveled before she had anything worth unraveling it with. Instead, she memorized the shapes of the letters, the exact placement of the ash, and left the hearth exactly as she'd found it. Over the following days, she watched. From the shadow of a servant's alcove, she observed 2 more meetings between Serafina and the unfamiliar nobles. Different faces this time, different crests, though always that same dark red edging. She began quietly mapping them in her mind, which noble houses had sent representatives to the chapel, which crests she didn't recognize, which conversations died the moment a servant entered the room. A conspiracy, she was beginning to understand, wasn't one woman acting alone. It was a network, and Serafina was only the piece of it standing closest to the throne. She was so careful, so exact, that for nearly 2 weeks, no one noticed anything different about her at all. Almost no one. "You've been different lately," Prince Alaric said one afternoon, catching her alone in the east corridor as she carried a stack of pressed linens toward the guest chambers. His voice was quiet, careful, not accusing, just observant in a way that startled her. "I don't know what you mean, my lord," Celine said, keeping her eyes down, her voice perfectly level. "You watch the halls now, not the way a maid watches for spills or dropped goblets, the way a soldier watches for an ambush." He studied her for a long moment. "I've suspected something is wrong in this palace for weeks, Celine. I have no proof, only instinct. An instinct tells me you've noticed something too." Celine's heart beat faster, but her face gave nothing away. 6 years of invisibility had taught her that much, at least, how to hold stillness like armor. "I only serve the household, my lord," she said. "I noticed what I meant to notice." Alaric didn't press further, but as he walked away, he glanced back once, and Celine understood that he wasn't convinced, and that, for now, that uncertainty was exactly what kept them both safe. She told him nothing, not because she didn't trust him, but because half-proof shared too early could unravel everything before it was ready to be seen. If Serafina's people learned that the prince and the maid suspected the same thing, the conspirators would simply vanish and take their evidence with them. She needed something undeniable, something that couldn't be explained away as coincidence or servant gossip. Meanwhile, in her chambers, each evening, Serafina had begun to notice something too. A maid who lingered a half-second too long near her door, linens delivered at slightly different times than usual, a stillness in the halls that felt, to her sharpened instincts, less like coincidence and more like being watched. She said nothing to anyone, but she began locking her private correspondence in a case only she carried the key to, and she started glancing over her shoulder in corridors she'd once walked without a second thought. The net was tightening on both sides, and neither woman knew exactly how close the other one had come. It was on a rain-heavy evening nearly 3 weeks into her quiet investigation that Celine followed a maintenance passage she'd never had reason to use before, one that ran beneath the royal kitchens, past disused storage rooms, thick with dust and cobwebs, and there, hidden behind a false wall of stacked crates, she found them, sealed containers, a dozen at least each, stamped with the same ancient alchemical marking, a crimson sigil she had never seen before but which sent a cold, certain dread crawling up her spine the moment her candlelight fell across it. Whatever was inside those containers, it wasn't wine. Celine stood frozen in the dust and candlelight, staring at the sealed containers stacked behind the false wall, and understood with sudden, sickening clarity that she had just crossed a line she could never step back from. If anyone found her here, there would be no explanation that saved her. She counted the containers without touching them. 12, each stamped with the same crimson sigil, an alchemical mark she didn't recognize but that made the fine hairs on her arms rise regardless. She memorized their placement exactly, the angle of the crates hiding them, the precise layer of dust undisturbed around their edges, so she would know instantly if anyone moved them before she returned. Then she backed out of the passage the way she'd come, sealing the false wall behind her with hands that only began shaking once she was 3 corridors away. She needed to know what was inside those containers, and there was only one place, in the palace, where she might find out without asking a single dangerous question. The royal alchemists worked in a chamber beneath the West Tower, a room Celine had delivered supplies to 100 times without ever once being noticed by the scholars inside. They were old men, mostly, absorbed in their work, accustomed to servants moving quietly around them like part of the furnishings. It was, Celine realized, the perfect place to become invisible on purpose. Over the following days, she volunteered for every task that brought her near that chamber. She refilled ink. She delivered fresh candles. She lingered just long enough, each time, to listen. It took 4 visits before she heard anything useful. An old alchemist named Master Thessaly muttering to his apprentice about a crimson variant logged incorrectly in the palace inventory, a substance that in its purified form could dissolve into enchanted royal blood without altering color, scent, or taste, undetectable by any conventional test known to the court. Celine nearly dropped the tray of candles in her hands. She waited until the chamber emptied for the evening meal, and then, moving faster and more carefully than she'd ever moved in her life, she slipped back into the maintenance passage beneath the kitchens. She pried open the corner of a single container. Just enough, just barely, and used a small vial she'd carried hidden in her apron for exactly this purpose, to scrape out the smallest possible sample of the crimson substance inside. She sealed the container exactly as she'd found it. She left no trace. But she couldn't test it herself. She had no training, no equipment, and testing it wrong could destroy the only evidence she had. And she couldn't trust the royal alchemists, not when she had no idea which of them, if any, might already be compromised. So on her one free day that week, Celine did something she had never done in 6 years of service. She left the palace grounds entirely. She traveled 2 hours by cart to a small stone cottage on the edge of the old scholars' quarter home to a retired royal alchemist named Marin Voss, no relation to the prince, though Celine had heard the name mentioned once in passing by a kitchen steward who spoke of her with quiet reverence. Marin had served 3 kings before retiring from court politics and was known among the few who still remembered her as one of the last practitioners of the old blood-testing rites. Methods too slow and too exacting for the modern court, but methods that could not be fooled. Marin studied Celine for a long moment on her doorstep before letting her in. "You're not a noble," the old woman said. It wasn't a question. "No," Celine admitted. "I am a maid. I have no right to ask this of you. But I believe I've found something that could kill the king." Something in Celine's voice must have carried more weight than her apron and plain dress suggested, because Marin stepped aside without another word and let her in. The testing took the better part of the night. Marin worked in near silence, mixing the crimson sample with drops of blessed water, murmuring old incantations over a shallow silver basin, watching for reactions too subtle for any untrained eye to catch. Celine sat by the fire and waited, her hands clasped so tightly together her knuckles had gone white. Near midnight, Marin finally looked up from the basin, her expression grave. "It's real," she said quietly. "A blood poison, ancient and exceptionally rare. I haven't seen its signature in over 30 years. It's designed to dissolve completely into enchanted blood. No color change, no scent, no taste. A single dose is enough to kill within minutes of ingestion, and it would show no trace afterward that any physician could identify as anything but a natural failing of the heart." Celine's chest went cold. How much would it take? For 12 containers full? Marin met her eyes. "Enough to kill everyone who drinks from that cake. Your king, his council, every noble house seated at that reception." She paused. "If what you're describing is truly meant for a royal wedding feast, child, this isn't an assassination. It's an execution of an entire government in a single afternoon." Celine didn't remember the cart ride back to the palace. She didn't remember climbing the narrow servant stairs to her chamber, or closing the door behind her, or sinking down against it until her knees gave out entirely. She had known, somewhere in her, since the night in the chapel, that this was real. But knowing and confirming were different weights entirely, and now that the second one had settled fully onto her shoulders, she found she couldn't hold it upright. King Lucian, Prince Alaric, Cassian, who had trained half the palace guard with his own hands, every noble house that had ever shown her the smallest kindness, all of them gone in a single afternoon over a slice of cake, blessed in a tradition older than the crown itself, while Seraphina stood at the center of it all in white, weeping perfect. Practiced tears for cameras and court records that would never know the truth. Celine pressed her palms against her eyes and let herself break, just once, just for a few minutes, in the privacy of her own small room where no one could see a maid crying over a kingdom that would never know her name. Then she wiped her face and stood and forced her mind back into the sharp, careful stillness that had carried her this far. She had proof now, real, undeniable proof. But when she counted the days remaining on her fingers in the dark, her stomach dropped all over again. The wedding was in 4 days, and she still had no idea how a single maid was supposed to stop it. Wedding week arrived wrapped in silver light and the scent of black roses, and the palace seemed to hum with a joy Celine no longer knew how to bear. King Lucian moved through those final days, lighter than she had ever seen him. He walked the halls, greeting servants by name. Not just Celine, but the stable boys, the laundry girls, the youngest kitchen apprentice who had only started that spring. He stopped to ask an elderly steward about his ailing wife. He forgave a nervous page who spilled wine across a ceremonial banner, laughing it off with a warmth that made the boy's shoulders drop in relief instead of terror. This was why they loved him. Not his crown, not his centuries of rule, not the ancient bloodline that ran through his veins. But this, the plain, stubborn decency of a king who genuinely believed that kindness could outlast cruelty, that enemies given enough grace could become allies, that the vampire houses which had warred for centuries might finally set down their blades, because he was willing to set his down first. It was, Celine thought, watching him from the edge of the great hall as tailors fussed over his ceremonial coat, the single most beautiful and most dangerous thing about him. Because a king who believed the best of everyone was a king who would never suspect the woman standing beside him at the altar. Celine carried that knowledge like a stone lodged beneath her ribs all through wedding week, and it grew heavier with every hour that passed. She had proof now, real, undeniable proof, tested by careful hands and confirmed beyond doubt. And still she hadn't spoken a single word of it to the one person who needed to hear it most. Tell him. Something in her whispered every time she passed him in the corridor. Just tell him. But every time, the thought rose. Another followed close behind it, cold and precise. She imagined walking into his private chambers and laying the truth at his feet. She imagined Seraphina's allies, whoever they truly were, scattered through noble houses she still hadn't fully mapped, learning within the hour that a maid had gone to the king with accusations. The containers beneath the kitchens would vanish before nightfall. The letters, the meetings, every fragment of proof she had painstakingly gathered would dissolve into nothing, and what would remain would be only her word against a beloved bride's tears. Jealousy, they would call it, a servant's delusion. An attempt to sabotage the king's happiness out of envy or madness. And if Lucian, for even a moment, doubted her, if love clouded what should have been obvious, Celine understood exactly what would follow. A trial for treason held in secret, evidence conveniently absent, and an execution quiet enough that no noble house would ever think to question it. A maid who accused a future queen and couldn't prove it wasn't protected by any law in the kingdom. She would simply disappear, and the wedding would proceed exactly as planned. She could not warn him privately. Not yet. Not until the moment arrived when the truth could not be hidden, denied, or erased by anyone. While Celine wrestled with that impossible math in the quiet of her own mind, Seraphina moved through the final days of wedding preparation with flawless, radiant calm. A calm Celine now understood was armor worn so long it had become indistinguishable from the woman underneath. That evening, in the same abandoned chapel beneath the palace, Seraphina met with her conspirators for what Celine would later learn was the final time before the wedding. "Everything is in place," one of the nobles said. "The moment the toast is given, the guards along the east corridor will be occupied with the arrival procession. You'll have perhaps 3 minutes before anyone realizes what's happening in the hall." 3 minutes is more than enough, Seraphina answered. and there was no warmth left in her voice at all. None of the practiced sweetness she wore like a second gown in front of the court. The horses will be waiting at the servants' gate. By the time anyone thinks to stop a grieving bride fleeing her husband's deathbed, we'll already be past the northern border. And if someone suspects early, Seraphina's smile was thin and cold. No one suspects a bride. That's the entire point of a wedding. She had no idea, standing in that candlelit chapel finalizing her escape, that a maid had already stood in that same doorway weeks earlier and heard enough to unravel everything. Elsewhere in the palace, entirely unaware of any of it, Lady Evelyn Morcant spent that same evening deep in wedding logistics, checking guest lists against seating charts confirming the final delivery of flowers, reviewing the order of ceremony with the palace stewards, line by line. She had never once doubted her closest friend, not for a single moment, and she moved through those final preparations with the pure, uncomplicated joy of a woman helping someone she loved step into happiness. She would learn the truth soon enough, but not tonight. Celine lay awake long after the candles in her chamber had burned to stubs, turning the impossible problem over and over until, sometime past midnight, the shape of an answer finally settled into place. She couldn't warn Lucien privately. Any private accusation could be buried, denied, erased, but a truth revealed in front of the entire kingdom, witnessed by every noble house, impossible to deny, impossible to bury before hundreds of eyes. That was a truth no conspiracy could undo. The exposure would have to happen at the wedding itself, in front of everyone. The moment the blood cake was brought forward, before a single slice could be served, it was reckless. It was possibly the last thing she would ever do, but it was the only way the truth would survive long enough to matter. She would need one final piece, though, undeniable physical proof taken from the cake itself, tested and confirmed in the hours before the ceremony so there could be no doubt when she spoke. The following evening, with the completed blood cake standing finished and guarded in the royal kitchens awaiting only the morning's ceremony, Celine volunteered for the final linen delivery to the kitchen staff, a task so mundane no one thought to question her presence there. While the head cook's back was turned, she reached out with trembling fingers and scraped the smallest possible sample of frosting from the base of the cake, sealing it inside a small cloth pouch she had kept hidden in her apron for exactly this moment. Her heart hammered as she slipped back out into the corridor, the tiny sample hidden against her palm. There was no more time left to hesitate. The wedding was tomorrow. There was no time to travel 2 hours to Marin Voss's cottage again. The wedding was hours away, and Celine needed confirmation before the sun rose over the cathedral spires. So she did the only thing left to her. She went, in the darkest hour of the night, to the chamber beneath the west tower where the royal alchemists worked. Not as a servant delivering candles this time, but as a woman with nothing left to lose. Master Thessaly looked up from his desk with the mild irritation of a man interrupted past midnight, an expression that shifted the moment he saw the sealed pouch trembling in Celine's outstretched hand. "I need this tested," she said. "Tonight, before the ceremony." "Girl, do you understand what hour it is?" "I understand exactly what hour it is," Celine said, and something in her voice, steady, certain, utterly unlike the quiet deference he was used to hearing from palace servants, made the old alchemist set down his quill. She told him only what he needed to know. A sample from the ceremonial blood cake, a suspicion that could not wait for morning. She did not tell him whose hands had prepared it, or what she had already confirmed weeks earlier with Marin Voss. She needed a second, undeniable confirmation from someone within the palace itself, someone whose word carried weight the court could not dismiss. Thessaly worked in tense silence, mixing the sample with drops of enchanted testing solution in a shallow silver dish, murmuring the old verification rites under his breath. Celine stood rigid by the door, watching the seconds crawl past on the tower's ancient water clock. The solution turned black in an instant. Thessaly went very still. "This is not a testing error," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "This reaction only occurs in the presence of a concentrated blood toxin. Whoever prepared this cake did not make a mistake in the kitchens." He looked up at her, understanding dawning slow and horrified across his face. "Where did you get this sample?" "From the blood cake being served at tomorrow's wedding feast." The old alchemist's face went the color of ash. "I need your word," Celine said before he could speak. "Not your testimony yet. Just your silence until I tell you it's time. If this reaches the wrong ears before the ceremony, the evidence disappears, and so do I." Thessaly studied her for a long moment, the maid he'd walked past 100 times without truly seeing, and finally nodded once, grimly. "You have it." Celine spent what remained of that night preparing with the same careful precision she'd used to build every piece of this investigation. She wrote out, in small, careful script, everything she had witnessed. The chapel meetings, the overheard words, the dismissed servants, the sealed containers beneath the kitchens. She copied, as best her memory allowed, the fragments of burned letters and the strange serpent-tailed signature. She listed every unfamiliar noble crest she had seen pass through that chapel doorway. Then she hid it all. The tested sample, sealed and labeled, went into the lining of her apron, stitched shut with thread she'd pulled from her own sleeve. The written testimony she folded into a thin wax-sealed packet and tucked beneath a loose floorboard in her chamber, along with instructions, in case the worst happened to her before morning, addressed simply to Prince Alaric Voss. Copies of everything else she distributed in 3 separate places, so that no single discovery could erase the whole of what she'd built. By the time gray light began touching the edges of her chamber window, Celine Ashford, maid of the royal palace, had become something closer to a soldier preparing for a battle no one else knew was coming. She was crossing the servants' courtyard just after dawn, when Prince Alaric stepped into her path, and this time, there was no pretense of coincidence in the way he did it. "Celine." His voice was low, urgent. "I've watched you for weeks. I said nothing because I trusted you had your reasons. But the wedding is in hours, and whatever you know, whatever you're carrying, I need you to tell me now." Celine looked at him for a long moment. Every instinct told her that Alaric was exactly who we appear to be, a man who loved his cousin and feared for him. But she had learned over these past weeks that instinct alone was not proof, and that the wrong word spoken even to the right person could still unravel everything before it was time. "I can't tell you," she said quietly. "Not yet. But I need you to trust me, Alaric. Trust me until the cake is served." His jaw tightened. Whatever answer he'd hoped for, it wasn't that. But something in her face must have convinced him it was all she could give, because after a long moment, he simply nodded. "Until the cake is served," he repeated. "Celine, whatever this is, don't be a hero alone." She didn't answer that. She wasn't sure, standing there in the pale morning light, that she had any choice left in the matter. Across the palace, in chambers filled with white silk and pearl, Seraphina Vale stood perfectly still as her attendants fastened the final pieces of her wedding gown and allowed herself, for the first time in months, the smallest private smile. By tonight, it would all be finished. The toast would be given, the cake would be served, and in the chaos and grief that followed, the collapse of an entire royal bloodline in a single afternoon, an entire government brought down before it could even understand what had struck it. She would already be past the northern border, free, wealthy, beyond imagining, and utterly untouchable. No one suspected a bride. That had always been the entire elegant point. She had no idea that a maid's testimony already sat hidden beneath a floorboard 3 corridors away, addressed to the one man in the palace who had never stopped questioning her. By mid-morning, the cathedral bells began to ring across the kingdom, deep and resonant, calling every noble house to the wedding of the century. Servants rushed through the halls with final preparations. Guards took their positions along the processional route. Somewhere in the East Wing, King Lucian Draven stood before a mirror in his ceremonial coat, smiling at his own reflection with the easy, trusting warmth of a man who believed, completely and without reservation, that he was about to marry the woman who would help him build a lasting peace. And in the servants' quarters, Celine Ashford pressed her palm flat against the sealed sample stitched into her apron, closed her eyes, and listened to the bells ring the beginning of the end. The royal cathedral had never looked more magnificent, and Celine thought, standing at the edge of the great hall with a tray of ceremonial wine bounced against her hip, that it had never looked more like a beautifully decorated tomb. Black roses climbed every marble column, their petals dark as old blood against white stone. Hundreds of silver candles burned in towering iron sconces, their flames bending and swaying, though no wind moved through the sealed cathedral doors. Stained glass windows, centuries old, scattered fractured red and violet light across the gathered nobility below. Hundreds of ancient vampire houses seated in row upon row of gilded pews, jewels and crowns catching candlelight like scattered stars. At the altar stood King Lucien Draven, resplendent in a black coat embroidered with silver thread, his expression soft with a joy that made even the coldest nobles in the room smile in spite of themselves. Celine knew every face that mattered in that cathedral now, mapped and memorized over weeks of quiet, careful watching. Lord Cassian Thorne stood near the altar in ceremonial armor, hand resting out of habit near the hilt of his sword. Prince Alaric Voss sat rigid in the front pew, his eyes blinking toward Celine every few minutes, despite his best effort not to. Lady Evelyn Morcant sat radiant and unknowing beside the other bridesmaids, dabbing happy tears from the corner of her eye. Behind them dozens of noble houses Celine now recognized by crest and bloodline. Draven allies, most of them along with a small, dangerous handful, whose houses bore that same dark red edging she'd first seen in the abandoned chapel weeks ago. And at the center of it all, gliding down the aisle in white and pearl, was Seraphina Vale, radiant, composed, utterly convincing in her performance of a blushing bride about to marry the man she loved. Celine's hands were steady. She had spent weeks preparing for this exact moment, and yet nothing could have fully prepared her for the sheer crushing weight of standing in that cathedral, knowing what she knew, watching hundreds of unsuspecting faces smile toward a cake that would kill nearly all of them. The ceremony passed in a blur of vows and old vampire rites, words spoken in a language older than the kingdom itself, blessings invoked over the joined hands of the king and his bride. Celine barely heard any of it. Her eyes stayed fixed on the great doors at the rear of the hall where 4 servants now wheeled forward the towering ceremonial blood cake, its white frosting gleaming, dark red rose petals scattered across its base like drops of blood against snow. The cathedral erupted in soft, delighted applause as the cake was set upon the altar table. Lucien turned to his bride, smiling, and lifted the ceremonial knife, an ornate silver blade passed down through generations of Draven kings, used only once in a ruler's lifetime. This was it. Celine set down her tray. Her heart hammered so violently she was certain someone would hear it. She reached into the hidden seam of her apron and felt the small silver vial resting there, cold against her fingertips. The knife hovered above the cake. Seraphina's hand rested lightly over Lucien's, guiding the blade downward, her face a perfect mask of joy. Celine moved. She crossed the space between the servants' alcove and the altar in a handful of steps, faster than any maid should have been able to move, faster than anyone in that stunned cathedral had time to process. She heard, distantly, a gasp ripple through the front pews as she passed, someone assuming she was simply another servant rushing to assist. They were wrong. Celine reached Seraphina in an instant, seized a fistful of her elegant, pinned hair, and slammed her face down directly into the towering blood cake with every ounce of strength she possessed. The world exploded. Blood-red frosting erupted across the altar table in a violent spray, splattering across white silk and gold embroidery, across the king's ceremonial coat, across the marble floor beneath them. The knife clattered from Lucien's stunned hand. A goblet somewhere in the front pews shattered against stone. Hundreds of nobles surged to their feet as one, a wave of gasps and shouted confusion rolling through the cathedral like thunder. Lord Cassian moved first, sword half drawn, closing the distance to the altar in 3 long strides, his hand closing hard around Celine's arm. Have you lost your mind? Celine didn't fight him. She didn't even try to pull away. King Lucien stood frozen at the altar, staring at the scene before him. His bride, his wedding, the sacred blood cake, all of it in ruin, utterly unable to comprehend what he was witnessing. His mouth opened, but no words came. Prince Alaric was on his feet, one hand raised toward Cassian, as if to stop him, though he himself looked just as stunned as everyone else in that cathedral. Every noble house in that hall stared at Celine Ashford, with the same expression, horror, disbelief, the collective certainty that the king's quiet, invisible maid had simply, finally snapped. "Guards!" someone shouted from the pews. "Seize her!" Cassian's grip tightened on Celine's arm, his sword hand tensing, and in that single, suspended second, with the entire kingdom's nobility staring at her in stunned fury, with Cassian's blade a breath from being drawn. With Lucian's devastated eyes fixed on the ruin of his wedding, Selene lifted her free hand into the candlelight and raised the small silver vial for every soul in that cathedral to see. The hall went utterly silent. "No one eats this cake," Selene said, her voice carrying clean and steady across the stunned quiet, not a single tremor betraying the terror pounding through her chest. The bride poisoned it. For a long suspended moment, nobody moved, nobody breathed. Even Cassian's grip on her arm went slack with shock. Then behind them, frosting still dripping from her ruined veil, Seraphina Vale lifted her head from the wreckage of the blood cake, and for one unguarded instant, before the mask could slide back into place, Selene saw something flash across the bride's face that no one else in that cathedral caught. Not confusion, not innocence, fear. Lucian's gaze snapped between his maid and his bride, his expression fracturing into something raw and uncertain. For the first time in the entire ceremony, "Test it," Selene said, before anyone could speak, before the moment could slip away and be explained back into innocence. "Test the cake, my lord, before a single soul in this hall drinks from it." Cassian's hand finally released her arm. His eyes moved from Selene to the frosting-smeared bride to the king's stricken face, and something in his soldier's instincts, honed over decades of reading danger in a room, told him the maid was not the one who should be afraid. Alchemists. Cassian's voice rang out across the frozen cathedral, sharp with sudden command. "Bring the royal alchemists forward. Test the cake, now." Master Thessaly moved through the stunned crowd with two younger alchemists at his side, a silver testing dish already in hand, his weathered face grim with the knowledge of what he already suspected he would find. The cathedral held its breath as he approached the ruined cake, frosting still dripping down its tiers, rose petals scattered across the altar like fallen snow-stained red. He scraped a fresh sample directly from the cake's exposed interior, untouched by Selene's earlier collection, undeniable in its origin, and mixed it with drops of enchanted testing solution in the shallow dish, murmuring the old verification rites under his breath, just as he had hours earlier in the privacy of his tower chamber. Hundreds of nobles leaned forward as one. The solution turned black. A collective gasp tore through the cathedral, followed by a silence so complete Selene could hear her own pulse hammering in her ears. "Poison," Thessaly announced, his voice carrying grim and unshaking across the hall. "A concentrated blood toxin, undetectable by taste or scent, designed to dissolve completely into enchanted blood, enough in this cake alone to kill every soul who drank from it within minutes." He looked up, his eyes finding King Lucian at the altar. "My king, this is genuine. This is not a servant's delusion. Someone intended for this entire cathedral to die today." The words landed like a blade dropped from the ceiling. Every eye in that hall turned, as one, toward Seraphina Vale. "That's absurd," Seraphina said, frosting still clinging to her ruined veil, her voice rising with practiced, desperate indignation. "This maid attacked me, assaulted the king's own bride in front of the entire court, and now you'll take her word over mine? She's clearly unstable, jealous of a position she could never." "The alchemist tested the cake, not the maid's word," Prince Alaric said, rising from the front pew, his voice cutting cleanly through hers. "And I think, Seraphina, you should explain why you insisted on privately inspecting that cake weeks before anyone else was permitted near it." A ripple of unease moved through the noble houses seated closest to the altar. Seraphina's composure cracked, just slightly at the edges. "I don't have to answer accusations from a prince who has resented me since the engagement was announced. Or," Alaric continued, pulling from beneath his ceremonial coat a small folded packet, "you could explain these." He held up fragments of burned letters, copies Selene had painstakingly recreated from memory during her weeks of investigation, matched now against originals. Alaric himself had quietly recovered after Selene's warning that morning, unable to sit idle once he understood the shape of what she was carrying. The serpent-tailed signature was unmistakable even at a distance, catching candlelight as gasps rippled outward through the pews. Seraphina's eyes went to the letters, and for the first time in the entire ceremony, true panic broke through the mask. She ran. It happened in an instant. Serafina, wrenching free of the stunned attendants near the altar, gathering her ruined skirts, sprinting for the side entrance that led toward the servants' gate and beyond it. The horses her conspirators had waiting at the northern border. She made it 3 steps before Cassian moved. The commander crossed the distance in a blur, closing his hand around her arm with the same iron grip he'd used on Celine minutes earlier, except this time there was no hesitation in it at all. Serafina fought against him, snarling, all elegance stripped away now, revealing something colder and far more desperate beneath. "Let me go! You have no proof, Joel, real proof this is a conspiracy against me." "The poison in your wedding cake is proof enough," Cassian said grimly, wrenching her still. At that moment, the great doors of the cathedral burst open and a contingent of palace guards dragged 3 struggling figures into the hall, the same nobles Celine had watched meeting Serafina in the abandoned chapel weeks earlier captured. She would later learn at Prince Alaric's quiet order, the moment he'd left her in the courtyard that morning, unwilling to simply trust and wait when he could act as well. "We found them attempting to flee through the northern gate, my lord," one of the guards reported, forcing the 3 conspirators to their knees before the altar. Horses saddled, bags packed, gold enough to fund a small army. The cathedral erupted into chaos, hundreds of voices rising at once, nobles turning to each other in horrified whispers, the full scale of what had nearly happened finally crashing down over the gathered court. Near the front pews, Lady Evelyn Morcant sat utterly still, her hand pressed against her mouth, tears sliding silently down her face as she stared at the woman she had called her closest friend for years, the woman she had helped plan seating charts and flower arrangements for. Completely unaware that she had been helping orchestrate the deaths of everyone she loved. "Evelyn, please," Serafina said, twisting in Cassian's grip, her voice cracking with something that might have been genuine desperation now that every other mask had failed. "You know me. You know I would never— I don't know you at all," Evelyn whispered, and the words seemed to cost her everything she had left. "I don't think I ever did." King Lucian had not moved from the altar through all of it. He stood motionless amid the wreckage of frosting and shattered goblets, staring at the woman he had loved, at the letters at the 3 captured conspirators kneeling before him, and slowly, visibly understanding settled over his face. Replacing shock with something far heavier, his eyes finally found Celine, still standing where Cassian had released her, her hands trembling now that the moment had finally passed, the full weight of what she'd done crashing over her all at once. "You knew," Lucian said quietly, his voice carrying through the stunned silence of the hall. "You knew, and you had no way to tell me safely, so you did the only thing that would have worked." Celine met his eyes and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that the cake, the letters, and the captured conspirators hadn't already spoken far more clearly than she ever could have. Lucian turned to Cassian, his voice hardening into something Celine had never heard from him before. The voice perhaps of the king he had always been capable of becoming, beneath all that gentleness. "Seal the palace. No one leaves these grounds until we understand the full depth of this conspiracy. Every noble house that sent a representative to that chapel will answer for it tonight." Cassian nodded once sharp and grim and began issuing orders across the cathedral, guards fanning out toward every exit, servants ushered into side chambers for questioning, the captured conspirators dragged toward the palace dungeons beneath a wall of hundreds of horrified watching eyes. The wedding of the century had become, in the span of a few catastrophic minutes, the beginning of the largest investigation the kingdom had seen in over 100 years. And somewhere beneath the chaos, Celine Ashford realized, with a strange, hollow disbelief that she had actually survived it, the investigation that followed consumed the palace for 9 days and 9 nights, and by the time it was finished, the full shape of the conspiracy had unraveled into something even Celine hadn't fully imagined. Investigators found the 12 sealed containers exactly where she left them beneath the royal kitchens, along with 3 more hidden in the wine cellars, all bearing the same crimson alchemical marking. They found ledgers hidden in a false drawer of Serafina's writing desk, detailing payments made to a network of rival noble houses across 2 neighboring territories, houses that had never truly accepted King Lucian's rule and had waited years for an opportunity like this one. They found correspondence, Some burned, some carelessly preserved, mapping out a plan that had been in motion for over a year, long before Lucien had ever proposed marriage. They found the escape route Serafina had prepared: horses, gold, forged papers bearing a new identity, a small estate purchased quietly across the northern border under a false name. And they found, perhaps most damning of all, testimony. The 3 conspirators captured at the northern gate, faced with overwhelming evidence and the certainty of their own execution, spoke at length in exchange for leniency, confirming every detail Celine had gathered in the shadows over 6 long weeks: the chapel meetings, the poison's origin, the plan to eliminate nearly the entire ruling class of the kingdom in a single afternoon. Lady Serafina Vale was tried before the full royal council 11 days after her wedding. Never was. The evidence against her was so complete, so thoroughly documented, that the trial itself lasted less than a single day. She was convicted of treason against the vampire crown, stripped of her noble title, and sentenced to imprisonment in the deepest halls of the palace dungeons, a fate, some whispered, far crueler for a woman who had craved a throne than any swift execution would have been. Her allied noble houses fared little better. Titles were revoked. Lands were seized by the crown. 2 lesser lords who had supplied gold to fund the conspiracy were exiled beyond the kingdom's borders, their names struck from every royal record that had ever honored them. By the time the dust settled, the kingdom understood exactly how close it had come to losing everything in a single elegant afternoon of frosting and false vows. On the 10th day, King Lucien summoned the entire court to the Great Hall, not for another wedding, but for something the kingdom had never witnessed before. Celine stood near the back of the hall as she always had, dressed in her plain servant's uniform, uncertain why she'd been asked to attend at all. She startled badly when a royal steward called her name and gestured for her to come forward through the parted crowd of nobles, all the way to the foot of the throne. King Lucien descended the day steps himself rather than remaining seated above her, a gesture that drew murmurs of surprise to the watching court, for kings did not typically lower themselves before servants. "I owe you an apology," Lucien said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, meant for every ear present. "In the chaos of that wedding, before I understood the truth, some part of me doubted you, wondered, however briefly, if you had lost your senses. I am ashamed of that doubt now, knowing what it cost you to carry this alone for weeks, with no one to trust, and every reason to stay silent." He paused, and his voice grew steadier, stronger, carrying the full weight of a proclamation. Today, the throne was not protected by a crown, a sword, or an army. It was protected by a maid who refused to stay silent. The hall remained utterly still. Hundreds of nobles who had once dismissed Celine as invisible furniture, now watching her with something closer to reverence. "Wealth alone cannot repay what you've done," Lucien continued. "So instead, I intend to change what this kingdom owes to those who serve it." He turned to address the full court. "From this day forward, any servant of this palace may report suspicion of wrongdoing directly to the crown without fear of dismissal or punishment for speaking. Testimony given anonymously, when warranted, will be protected under royal law. Every investigation undertaken within these walls must weigh evidence on its merit, regardless of the rank, birth, or station of the one who brings it forward. And the staff who serve this palace will receive legal protections and formal recognition. They have long been owed and rarely given." A ripple of astonishment moved through the noble houses, though none dared voice objection in the wake of what had nearly happened. Prince Alaric stepped forward from the crowd, inclining his head toward Celine with genuine humility. "I suspected something was wrong for weeks," he said, "but suspicion alone would have saved no one. It was your courage and your patience that stopped this before it began. The kingdom owes you a debt I don't think we can properly measure." Lord Cassian, standing at the head of the assembled royal guard, drew his sword and raised it in formal salute, a gesture reserved, traditionally, only for soldiers who had proven themselves in battle. "Vigilance," he said, his voice carrying across the ranks behind him, "can be as powerful as any blade. Let it be remembered that this hall stands today because one woman watched what an entire kingdom failed to see." Near the edge of the gathered court, Lady Evelyn Morcan stood with tears still fresh in her eyes, though her voice, when she spoke to Celine privately afterward, was steady with resolve. "I trusted her completely," she admitted quietly. I have to live with that now. But I promise you, I intend to spend whatever time it takes rebuilding the trust she shattered. Between the houses and within this palace, months passed, and slowly the kingdom healed. The noble houses that remained loyal rebuilt what trust had been lost. New laws took root, quietly transforming the relationship between crown and servant in ways the old court could never have imagined. And Celine Ashford, offered titles and wealth and a place among the nobility she had never once sought, chose instead to remain exactly where she had always been. She returned to her duties in the palace halls she loved, not out of obligation, and not for glory, but because service had always been the truest calling she'd ever known. One quiet morning, months after the wedding that never was, Celine carried fresh linens down the east corridor and passed King Lucien greeting a new kitchen apprentice by name, asking gently after the boy's family, laughing warmly at some small, clumsy mistake. It was such a small thing, and yet it was everything. Sometimes history remembers kings for the battles they win, but sometimes an entire kingdom survives because one observant maid noticed what everyone else chose to ignore, and found the courage to speak when silence would have been so much easier.